goes wrong, then we'll suffer. Ajahn Chah's message, through his life and through his presence, to me was no thing, no person, no event, no situation has the power to make you suffer, or even should be seen as negative, should be judged in any way. We're actually free to make our own decision. So this is how, say, towards the end of his life, for 10 years, I believe, from the early 80s to the early 90s, he didn't say a word. He simply lay in Wat Nong Pa Pong, and people were able to go and pay respects and take away whatever they were able to from the situation. And in time, Dharma was translated into English, tapes, and later CDs. And so these teachings lived on. Now, Ajahn Chah's strength, as I understand it and really experienced it, and his real wisdom was emphasizing Sangha. Sangha means the monastic Sangha, but it means community, and community harmony. But of course, as a monk, particularly his close focus of teaching, especially in the early years, had been on the monks who came to stay with him, because he was very unknown for many years. And there were key teachings that he brought into his monastic training. Some of the things we'll hear about later on, his Vinaya instructions. But essentially there were some key themes to Ajahn Chah's life, which the monastic Sangha inherited, tried their best to integrate into their own lives. And I feel it's very valuable to share to this day, because they're valid as timeless teachings. That his teachings come all the way from the Buddha's time, yet he was able to make them, bring them to life in the present moment, and then transmit them. So as I said at the beginning, it was tough in his monasteries. Khanti means patient endurance. It's a barami, it's spiritual quality. And partly, in those days, northeast Thailand was much poorer. There's been huge material development in the last 20 years. But it was also tough because Luang Por Chah made it tough. The tradition is what we call the Dutonga Tradition. So all the things like eating in one's alms bowl, going on alms round, and being frugal, and getting up early together as a Sangha, coming together and chanting these words together, supporting each other in our practice, and reflecting on Dhamma and meditating together through the wee hours of the dawn, and in the evening as well, sometimes late into the night. So this tough foundation, Khanti, patient endurance, was what gave the men and women living there the strength to put up with the difficulties. Now, the obstacles in life begin with the physical ones, difficulties from heat, cold, hunger, etc., and perhaps sharp words. But then also, as Luang Por Chah taught, the real patient endurance, the real need to bear with our own moods, our mental states, not to react and respond to the swings of delight and aversion, wanting and not wanting, liking, disliking, judging as good and bad, having a mind which is able to stay even and balanced, using a certain amount of patient endurance. And Ajahn Chah said himself, this takes a certain daring. I heard he was asked, well, what makes you special, Luang Por? What do you have that other monks don't have? He said, nothing really, but I dared. And this comes out when you listen to the monks who lived with him. He would say, patiently endure with patience. Dare to be patient, dare to endure. Because it takes a kind of courage. And so he managed to weave that into his monastic framework, with activities right throughout the day which are challenging, often physically difficult conditions, training you to go against the stream. You heard this morning Ajahn Sumedho saying he came back to Wat Pa Pong to offer his life to Ajahn Chah, and Ajahn Chah sent him off to establish Wat Panana Chah, which was the last thing he wanted to do, but to challenge us. And that's what we need in order to stand up to, or to, in order to really investigate and understand on a deeper level what was also at the heart of Ajahn Chah's teaching. Most of you don't speak Thai, but if you do learn any words of Thai, I would suggest the 2 words you should learn are mai ne. These 2 words mean not sure. And this was his own slightly loose and liberal translation of the common Buddhist teaching, sanya anicca, perception is impermanent, or just anicca in general. Sabbe sankhara anicca, all conditions are impermanent, all conditioned phenomena are impermanent. That's a very formal and lofty way of putting it. He would say, nothing is certain, nothing is stable. And this is a very direct teaching, one which we don't really have to have much experience with scriptures or much of a deep spiritual foundation to be able to take on and apply to our lives. We ask ourselves, yeah, actually, what is certain? And this response of the monk, when I asked him, if this is Ajahn Chah, if this is what happens to him, what hope is there for us? And he said, well, why do you assume he's suffering? And the answer is, yeah, it's true, it's not certain, is it? And straight away we're able to let go. So this idea of uncertainty was something which, for someone like myself, coming in cold, with no background in meditation, even with no interest, this wasn't something that I planned on doing for the rest of my life, just like Ajahn Sumedho. He was thinking of 2 years, I was thinking of 2 weeks. But it's like something reels you in, something inside you is saying, there's much more here than meets the eye. There's much more investigation to do. And if this is truth, you can't turn your back on it. If that's really what you feel, that life, as you understand it, really is uncertain, that where you're putting your certainty may well one day let you down, then it's almost like an obligation or a responsibility to seek something more solid, just as if we were building a house. We would need solid foundations. And Rinpoche himself would say again and again, we have to start with the foundation work. He would often talk about this when talking about sila, this being the foundations for our lives. So the ability to begin to see that all things were not sure. And this was something which would be a common theme in the Dhamma talks I began to read and began to listen to. So we start with seeing, yes, the body is uncertain, it's not sure. We see that people get old and sick, and although we know it's going to happen to all of us, we don't know when. In the sala, the hall, the meditation hall of Wat Bananacha, and many monasteries, there was a skeleton hanging up in a glass cabinet, which again, the first day I arrived, I looked at this skeleton and I really wondered what kind of a place I'd somehow landed in. But the van that dropped me off had already gone, and I didn't have any money, so I was stuck, at least for the moment, and that was before the mobile phones. I couldn't call home and say, get me out of here. So I was looking at this skeleton, and then at the bottom of the glass cabinet, in another smaller jar, was a very, very young baby which had died in infancy in a preserved jar, and that looked so horrible. But the teaching of that was more powerful than just that we're all going to get old and sick and die. It's really that actually it can happen anytime, even right at the beginning of life, when we would all say that shouldn't happen. It can. So we're beginning to contemplate and seeing how impermanence is much more a part of life than we would ever imagine. And so not only on the material realm, the physical realm, our own bodies, but then of course our thoughts. And more interestingly, this was what really intrigued me. And I think with a Western upbringing and education, many of you share kind of rigorous education. We hold very much to our perceptions and our views. We're actually trained to cultivate views and then hold on to them like mad. And it's very challenging to let go of them, and something that's very destabling. So one night I was listening to a talk in the hall to the senior monk, an English monk, many of you know, Ajahn Chah was giving a talk. And he began to talk about how our perceptions are impermanent, and began to talk about our views and opinions. And he just mentioned things like political views around the environment, or views around social issues. And he just simply asked the question again, can you really be sure about any of your views? That are any of them really absolutely sure? I mean, can you actually say that? It's not saying they're all wrong. You don't have to suddenly go into a sense that you don't know anything, but asking the question, can we really be sure that we're right? And again, simply that gives a little opening where we're able to see the truth, simply that we might be right, but we might be wrong. And just that opening to know that there was something to consider, I actually found almost like a huge burden was lifted off my heart. Because aged 18, as you know, there's so much pressure to know, what are you going to do? What would you like to be? What are your social attitudes and values? Are you politically correct? What kind of orientations do you have in all kinds of areas? You have to know. And there's this kind of constant challenge in group situations. Will you say the right thing and be accepted, or be convincing, or be successful, or just be right? And to be able to say, actually it's okay not to know, to hear the teacher encouraging that was not refreshing. It was, like I said, like a huge weight lifted. And again, another sense that this is truth. In the same way that we're going to get old and sick and die, it's truth. I realize, nothing is sure. Nothing is permanent, and nothing is stable. Even if things are permanent for a little, we can have a sense of a short-term permanency, but it's very unstable. And so what a sort of a very different way to investigate things. And so this is the kind of the gradual teaching, you could say, of Ajahn Chah, the particular dhammas that he picked up from. Not his own dhamma, this is the timeless teachings that the Buddha himself had taught. And those weren't his either, as he said again and again. This is akaliko. But Ajahn Chah's skill was to find a few current themes and weave them together. So from mai ne, not sure, or unstable, we come to, well then, what are we holding on to? So first we see that the holding on to our thoughts, our views, opinions, that's actually very difficult. It's like again, one of Luang Por Chah's similes was like carrying bags. You carry these bags around, and it's so heavy, and it feels so heavy. And somebody says, "Well, put down the bags," and you say, "Well, then I won't have my bags." And in a minute, you can still have them. Just put them down. You don't have to carry them all the time, and use them skillfully. And so, just to be able to put down that knowing was so uplifting and enlightening for the heart. In a sense, it made the heart feel light and less burdened, rather than more burdened. So that this is a theme which I'm sure you'll hear more of today, of letting go. Luang Por Chah taught us just to let go through seeing just how unsure all of these things were. So in a sense, this is a few very, very kind of snippets of his teachings, but just to share with you how somebody who's now long passed away, but even at that time wasn't teaching, how he was able to inspire people, not just myself, but many, many others, simply to dedicate their whole lives to the path. There's certainly a leap of faith, because even then and now, no one can prove Ajahn Chah's enlightenment or any of the enlightened ones. We don't have this direct knowledge. But we look and we see, how does somebody live their life? And what are the constant words they use? And then, particularly in times of adversity, when things become difficult, when the body is breaking down, when everything's going wrong, how do they react? And when somebody reacts with a smile, or with the equanimity, or with the metta, or with the sense of never mind, just let go, then we get a sense, it's a little inkling that this person has something, some kind of wisdom that we'd like to have as well. And so that was the experience. And as I said at the beginning, his sense of creating Sangha was so beautiful. And what struck me most was the true reverence, not just reverence, but deep love. The only word really is love, that his direct disciples and the lay people of Ubon had for him. In Thai we have the expression, Po Me Kruba Ajahn. Po Me means mother, father, and Kruba Ajahn means monk, teacher, like our Ajahn, Acharya or Sayadaw. So he was referred to as Po Me Kruba Ajahn, mother, father, teacher, mother, father, Ajahn. Not just Ajahn Chah. To people who lived with him and studied under him, he was mother, father, Ajahn Chah. So sometimes his name is translated as Luang Po, which means venerable father. But in Thai they acknowledge that side of him which was the mother too. He seemed to have cared for the Sangha, nurtured them through their early monastic years, not only giving birth to them as monks by ordaining them, but then nurturing them through their early years, leading by example, being there himself. 3 a.m, they used to say that sometimes you couldn't ring the bell because he would ring it first. And then when you got to the sala one day thinking you were going to get there first, you were second because he was there already. So leading by example, leading with metta, leading with love, but also, from what I've heard, being very fierce when it was time to be fierce. Because sometimes we do need a shock, like children, you have to scold them. I don't know, I'm not a parent, but from what I'm told, you do have to scold your children. They need their boundaries, they need their strict, clear guidelines, whether it's vinaya, whether it's admonishment, and he was there to do that, but in a way where everybody trusted that his intentions were entirely pure, that he had nothing but good wishes for people at all times. It wasn't that there were times when he wished everybody well, but then there were also times when he got angry with you and actually somehow experienced negativity. The outward expression of fierceness was simply knowing what we needed to learn. His disciples sometimes needed a sharp rebuke, and actually in Thai culture that was quite acceptable. With the Westerners, with their different conditioning and sense of fear and a deep, often inability to take strong words, he was very, very gentle. He was the warm and loving grandfather, and that was also the later years of his life. So he was this very skilled master in learning how to pass over the Dhamma that he had experienced. That sense of being a parent to the Sangha, and not just the Sangha. His kuti was like an open house. Ajahn Sumedho was telling me recently, even after evening chanting, 9 p.m, 10 p.m, sometimes villagers would come, they have a problem, and they would go and see him. He would receive them under his kuti with warmth, and they would tell them about his problem. And often it wasn't so much what he would give them, but simply the fact that he was there to listen to them and had time for them. So this sense of growing the Sangha. So every year now in Thailand there's an annual week-long meditation Dhamma practice festival and Dhamma talks. It's a bit like today's event, but it lasts 1 week, and there's 5,000 lay people and 2,000 monks camping in mosquito nets and tents and sleeping on mats in the forest of his monastery around his jedi, and waking up early, listening to Dhamma all day, practicing meditation, and recollecting and reflecting on the teacher. And what comes up again and again and again is that when we do this, when we come to practice in this way, it doesn't matter whether Ajahn Chah is long gone or the Buddha himself is 2,500 years ago gone before us. It doesn't really matter. We can all be disciples of the Buddha, we can all be disciples of Ajahn Chah. or any enlightened teacher, if we take those teachings and put them into practice. So in the same way, the Buddha had his very famous teaching to a monk when he told him, "One who sees the Dhamma sees me. Yo dhammang passati, so mang passati." One who sees the Dhamma sees me. One who sees me sees the Dhamma. And in Thailand, this is what's the constant refrain during this Ajahn Chah practice week is if we practice the Dhamma in the way our teachers did, then it's as if we see them. It wasn't that those disciples who were lucky enough to be there 30, 40 years ago and to be sitting in the same meditation hall with the master somehow got some magical some magical inspiration or transmission from him. It's up to us right now to take these teachings. Now there's so much books and Dhamma talks and information available, but do we dare to put it into practice in our daily life? Do we dare to challenge ourselves and say, actually, that perception I have is not sure? Can we stop ourselves when we're getting into an argument and say, hang on, I won't let my mind move towards negativity. I'll stay with metta, tolerance, understanding. You know, this is how to be a Ajahn Chah disciple in this modern life. And so for myself and many of the monks here and all the monks ordaining in his tradition today, we can't say we had Ajahn Chah as our teacher, but we can say those teachings are with us today, and we dedicate our life to the teacher in the same way that all of us here, I'm sure, are dedicating our lives at least to Buddha Dhamma Sangha. It's not really about an individual person, and today isn't about some kind of guru devotion to a particular individual, but about discussing, listening to, sharing, and celebrating timeless truths, and hopefully taking away some of it, part of it, reflecting on it, and then bringing it into our lives for our own well-being, for the benefit, for the happiness of us all. So on this occasion, it's a very great privilege to be invited to come and share these few short words. I sincerely wish that everybody here can take some inspiration from this whole event and is further encouraged and moved to share the spirit of Sangha, harmony, community life, practicing Dhamma Vinaya in line with the teachings of the Buddha, dedicating our lives to the Triple Gem. It seems to be a very worthy thing to devote ourselves to. So I'd like to end my talk there.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Venerable elders in the Sangha and lay community, I have been asked today to speak on Ajahn Chah's use of the Vinaya, the monastic discipline, as a way of training. Paul Samedo this morning was talking a bit about Ajahn Chah's way of using the Vinaya, and I remember last night I was speaking to him in his room, and he was saying that even though the Vinaya can seem very complicated, with lots of rules, when you looked at Ajahn Chah, it just looked like he was exhibiting freedom. You know, he didn't look like someone who was bound by rules. He just got this feeling when he met Ajahn Chah that there was just freedom there. It's a bit like when I was in a former life. You know, I used to play music, and to be a musician, you have to spend hours and hours and hours just doing basic exercises. And it can be very tedious and sometimes boring. It takes a lot of discipline. But once you've mastered that, then you are able to arrive at a state where it becomes more effortless. You don't have to think about it. It just becomes a natural way of life. And when the Buddha talked about what he was teaching, you know, he didn't call it Buddhism. He didn't call it Gautama Vada. You know? He could have called it Siddhartha Yana. But he called it Dhamma Vinaya. And he didn't just say, you know, after I die, then the Dhamma will be your teacher. That would have made sense. You know, the Dhamma is nature, the laws of life, the laws of nature, the laws of living in harmony with nature, the laws of truth that allow us to awaken, to live in harmony with the laws of nature. This is really what's liberating. This is what's special about the Dhamma. This is what is attractive about the Dhamma, this idea of liberation, freedom, a reduction of suffering, increase of happiness. But when he talked about his dispensation, his collection of teachings, he said, you know, this is the Dhamma in the Vinaya, as if it's one phrase, one inseparable combination. Because the Buddha was, in addition to being completely liberated, extremely practical. He understood people. He understood what it meant to live in a community. He understood ultimate reality, but he also understood conventional reality. And he was able to use his practical wisdom to create conventions which then would assist unenlightened people towards ultimate reality. And that, I think, is just as impressive as having realized the ultimate truth. You know, the fact that he was able to use his practical wisdom to create a lifestyle which would outlast him, which would outlast his generation, which would last amazing. Can you imagine trying to create something today that's going to still be around 2,552 years from now? So when we talk about Dhamma and Vinaya, we're talking about a lifestyle which is so intertwined that a lot of the ways that the Forest Masters would teach would kind of go in between and flow seamlessly between high Dhamma and very ordinary, mundane things. Ajahn Chah and his generation, they could be talking about anatta, or emptiness, 1 minute, and then flow seamlessly to, you know, who didn't wash the spittoons? And not really, there wasn't really a sense that there was a big difference between the two. Because if you're really taking responsibility for the Dhamma, then you're taking responsibility for developing mindfulness moment by moment. You take responsibility for washing the spittoons so other people don't have to. In Thailand, we used to make a lot of our own requisites out of white cloth, and then we'd have to sew it together. And mostly in those days, we didn't have electricity, and so we just had one of these treadle machines. and how the top thread and the bobbin thread would work together. It was very much the way that Dhamma and Vinaya work together. You know, they intertwine that way. They're different, and yet when you make an effort, when you sow, then they come together, and then you can actually create things. You create something useful and beautiful. Well, in the beginning, it's not beautiful, but it's useful. Just the other day, yesterday, was the Opposita. And one of the conventions of our tradition is that we come together. For those monastics who are fully ordained, we come together and chant the Patimokkha, which is the recitation of the 227 rules of the bhikkhu's training. And rituals such as this is a way of honoring the importance of Vinaya in our training, bringing it up. Even something as simple as that is a ritual which can tie us together. I mean, here we had monastics coming together from all different corners of the world. We had people coming from Europe, from Asia, from New Zealand, from all over the world. And okay, it's time to do the Patimokkha. Boom, we're all there. We're able to share in that communal harmony. And just knowing that for generations and generations and generations, that has been happening, this upholding of the Vinaya. It's very inspiring. It's like it ties us, you know, seamlessly in a tradition, in a lineage, right back to the Buddha. And it also ties us to the rest of the people in the world who are doing the same thing. And even in such small rituals, you know, a lot comes out. You know, the recitation of the Vinaya is held in such high regard that someone who is going to do the chanting, they get the high seat. Luang Por Sumedho was there, obviously the most senior one. But who gets the highest seat is the one who's chanting. But there's also a great sense of deference to seniority. So the one who's chanting then bows and asks for permission. You know, please, I ask for permission to recite the Vinaya. And then they're given permission to get on the high seat. And then when you go through the Vinaya, there are rules which are based on morality. There are rules which are based on restraining desire. There are rules which are based on laying a foundation for meditation. You know, if you're sitting in meditation, it doesn't take too long before some of the moral mistakes we might have made in life start to come to the surface in the form of memories. One of the hindrances that people regularly encounter in meditation is a sense of remorse for the things that, shouldn't have done that, or maybe I shouldn't have said that, or something I did or said in the past led to someone else feeling pain. And when that comes up in meditation, it's a natural karmic effect, which is different than guilt. But it's a hindrance to peace of mind nonetheless. So keeping a very pure standard, to the best of our ability, of monastic discipline, or an ethical standard, of which we call sila, then that naturally creates a very strong foundation for meditation. And then we have rules which assist communal harmony, which leads to peace within the harmony. We have rules which also just are based on the Sangha itself being an inspiring example in society. because especially in the world today, we're sometimes short of inspiring examples in society, in the mainstream society. So it's good to have a certain very clear boundaries. Because once we ordain, whether we like it or not, whether we realize it or not, we become a representative of the Buddha Dhamma, wearing these robes out in public. We're not invisible. Sometimes people notice us. And our behavior, our demeanor, our attitude, these all then reflect on the entire Sangha. So there's a deep responsibility. Okay, once we've taken on these robes, then there are certain rules which then encourage a certain proper, circumspect states of mind. When Ajahn Chah was first studying the Vinaya, initially he was living in a city monastery, a village monastery in those days, which didn't keep very strict Vinaya. And when he started to come across the monastic rules, he realized that, wait a minute, there's a bit of discrepancy here between the way the monastic Sangha is living in this monastery and what is supposed to be done according to the text. And so he started to feel a bit of something wasn't quite right there. And then he decided that, he was actually going to make that step to try to practice the Vinaya 100%. And when he really got into it, really started studying, then he would study sometimes for hours and hours and hours. And that's an important phase in understanding the Vinaya. It's like doing scales when you're a musician. Mastering the details. And at Ajahn Chah's monastery, sometimes they would just read out some of these Thai commentaries, for hours at a time. There's this Thai commentary called the Pubasika Wanana, in which some of the early Western monks had to sit there listening to this being read out in a language that they barely understood for hours at a time, over and over and over again. So I was saying this morning, if they want me to give a talk on how Ajahn Chah actually taught the Vinaya, maybe I'll just read out the Pubasika and give them a real flavor. I'm just sitting there for hours, patiently enduring. But then after Ajahn Chah had studied the Pubasika Wanana, after he'd studied the Patimokkha, the monastic discipline, after he'd studied the Visuddhimagga, these great commentarial works, it all just seemed to start to get so complicated. And by that time, he was getting more involved with other forest monks. And so he went to the great forest master, Ajahn Mun, and asked Ajahn Mun about this predicament. Here I am. I really want to practice the Vinaya, 100%, and yet, looking at all these details, it seems impossible that anyone can do that. And then Ajahn Mun said, that's true, but just focus on certain aspects of it, which are the essence. Try to learn how to distill the essence while still following the details. And the essence that Ajahn Mun encouraged at that time was what was called Hiri and Otapa. Hiri was this sense of conscience, having a sense of conscience or shame. And Otapa is a fear of wrongdoing. So if you have these two, then that's going to be an internal compass. It's going to be a guide. Make sure we don't go off track. Hiri it's compared to like if you have a metal bar and one half of the metal bar is smeared with excrement and the other half of the metal bar is red hot. And so the half of the metal bar is like a sense of shame and, things that we may have done in the past. We just don't, we're not proud of that. It's not clean. You don't really want to stick a hand in it. And then the types of actions that we can understand as being bad karma, we can see the connection between happiness, unhappiness, and our actions and our intentions. And so we don't even want to touch that because we know it's red hot. And so this forms like an internal guide that helps to distill the essence. So once you've mastered all of these details, then you kind of distill the essence. And then Ajahn Chah said from that point on, it starts to become more and more of a mind training. Less and less of just following rules, but more and more a mental training, because the whole lifestyle becomes so natural. In the beginning, it seems like, so many rules, do this, do this. You've got the Vinaya rules, and you've got monastic discipline, and you've got the protocols for the particular monasteries. There's so much to think about from the morning when you get up until going to bed at night. There's always something to do, and the proper way to do it, and the wrong way to do it, and now everyone's telling you which is which. It can seem kind of complicated, but once that becomes more internalized, then it actually leads to a great sense of simplicity, where you don't have to endlessly try to decide how things are going to be done externally. You don't have to, get together and have a discussion every day about how we're going to do things, because you just, okay, well, this is the way it's done. This is the agreed way. And even if people are coming from different corners of the world, if there's a shared monastic etiquette, then, boom, everyone knows this is the way you do things. You don't have to spend time in endless discussion. It actually simplifies things. So there are many rules which have to do with reduction of desire. Things which may not be necessarily evil per se, but help to restrain the heart from flowing out. Wanting this, not wanting that. There's lots of rules about food, for example. How to relate to food. Proper ways of relating to food. There was one time that Ajahn Chah was he needed to go to central Thailand, to Sarapuri, on some business. And he went with a group of his disciples. And he stayed at a monastery there that didn't keep the Vinaya all that strictly. And in the morning, Ajahn Chah and his disciples and the other monks would all go out on alms round, and then when they would come back, whatever food was gathered was then set down, and the lay people set it out. And then the monks just took the food without it being offered properly, arranged it, and then they had a very simple, perfunctory way of offering it, which wasn't really in accordance with the Vinaya. And in those days, Ajahn Chah was very strict. And so all the food that they got on that alms round, they wouldn't touch it, because after it had been improperly handled by the Sangha there, then it was passed down the line. But really all Ajahn Chah and his monks had was the rice, plain rice that they had gotten on alms round. And all the other food they would just let go by. And they didn't say anything. They didn't complain. they just ate plain rice, and as far as we know, they were content with it. But after being there for a few days, then the local monks started to say, what's the deal? You're not eating any of our food. And Ajahn Chah, being very sensitive, then said, well, I better go talk to the abbot. And so he went and spoke to the abbot and very politely explained the situation. Said, well, look, we have this standard that we follow, and according to our understanding, then we're not allowed to eat this food without it being properly offered. And he wasn't trying to change their way of doing it, but he just wanted to put them at ease, to let them know where he and his monks were coming from. And once that was explained, then the abbot of that monastery said, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. That's great. He's never before had he seen monks who were so meticulous about keeping the minor rules. And he said, that's wonderful. He said, that's fantastic, and he supported it. And so from that time on, they changed the way they were doing things. And so eating food that is not offered just one particular way, there's nothing particularly morally evil in it. But there are rules which can help to restrain our desire. When I was a young monk at Wat Bananachat, this branch monastery for non-Thai speaking monks that was begun by Ajahn Sumedho. In those days, in the afternoon, if you wanted to have a drink of tea or whatever, your only opportunity was to come at a particular time at the abbot's kuti, and there would be some big kettles, and they would get passed around twice. And that was it. You couldn't really make your own, whatever was there in the kettles. That was it. And occasionally the kettles were brought in, and they were sitting in there, and some young monk, maybe a bit over-enthusiastic, would go over and touch it and pick it up and start to pass it out before it was actually offered by the novices. And then according to Ajahn Chah's standard, that kettle, all that tea had to be sent right back to the kitchen. No one could have it. Or sometimes they would relax the standard a bit and say, well, only that monk can't have it. Depending on how much they wanted the tea, I think. But these are rules which are designed to reflect our own desire and bring us back to being mindful all the time. So there was nothing particularly morally apprehensible about going and touching and picking up a kettle of tea which was not properly offered. But it reflected back that that particular monk wasn't being completely mindful. And so the Vinaya works in this way, to be a reflection on our states of mind. It becomes more and more a mental training. Ajahn Chah would encourage his disciples to follow many of the Dutonga practices. Dutonga practices are austere practices that were encouraged or allowed by the Buddha. And so many of the forest masters would encourage their disciples to take on some of these practices. For example, just eating everything out of one bowl. Right? Now, you wouldn't have to do that according to the Vinaya, but this just adds one more notch of difficulty, which can put a little more pressure on our desire, a little more restraint is necessary. Because if you have a lot of good food, and then you have to throw it all in one bowl, it kind of gets a bit messy. Right? You get used to it after a while, but in the beginning, a lot of people find it a bit disgusting. Whatever you might you might have a nice dessert here, and then you might have spaghetti sauce here, then you might have peanut butter here, and they're individually all great, but once you mix them together, it's not great. Right? And then you throw a scoop of ice cream on top, and forget it. Just forget it. This is tough practice. And Ajahn Chah would generally encourage eating one meal a day. That was basically the standard, just one meal a day. And eating, before noon. This was the standard in the Vinaya. Now there's nothing evil. There's nothing morally wrong with eating food in the afternoon. But again, these rules just help to confine our desires within certain ranges, and they help to simplify life. Just keep the whole process around the meal just confined to a certain time of the day, and then refining it even more, just to have one meal a day. It's enough. If we're eating just as a medicine to keep the body going so we can practice the Dhamma, then it's enough, it's good enough. These days, if you go on wandering practice called Tudong, in the West, it really is a good practice because you're going out there with your bowl and you don't know what you're going to get. We do this in New Zealand regularly as part of our annual schedule. For a month every year we go wandering around the country. And if it's just monks themselves, without any lay attendants, then you can't carry food, you don't have any money. You're traveling around, and even if someone does offer you food one day, you can't store it the next day. So each day, you don't know where your next meal is coming from. It's a very good practice. And when you are offered food into the bowl, a great sense of gratitude starts to arise. Even for something very simple. Someone just gives you something very simple. A sense of gratitude arises. And that also, again, is bound up with how we use the Vinaya, because when we go on alms round, there are rules about behavior on alms round. We don't go out and ask. We're not allowed to ask people for food. We can stand silently. Someone understands what we're doing, then they can come and offer. If they come and ask, then we can explain. But we don't ask, we don't beg. And these days, the wandering practice is extended to international flights. This is the modern forest monk. And so that adds a whole nother aspect to it, because when you're on international flights, say, well, I can eat up till noon, but what time is it actually when you're flying through different time zones? Say, well, you can try to be really tricky and say, well, okay, they're serving lunch now. Well, let's see. In the country that I left from, it's still before noon. Should I take that as a standard? Or in the country that I'm going to, it's still before noon. But quite often, you just have to go back to the basic Vinaya standard, which is wherever we are, we take that time. And so quite often on international flights, you may have to go a long period of time. Maybe you're flying in the afternoon and the evening for a long period of time. This would tend to happen a lot when I'd go from Thailand back to the United States. It was a long period of time, almost 36 hours, before I could actually eat again. And it would be easy enough to justify in saying, oh, well, let's just be reasonable. But part of what is, I think, a good training about the Vinaya is that it forces us to say, okay, well, this is the boundary. And then once I come up against this boundary, what's my mental reaction? And that's really where the training comes in. That's what's really important. Much more important than whether we eat or not, is how we relate to that. What's going on in our mind and our reaction when that's taking place. And then we have rules about money. Money basically symbolizes getting your desires fulfilled. There's nothing particularly wrong about pieces of paper and coins, but money symbolizes that ability to fulfill your desires. And so when we renounce money, then we're making a very clear statement. This lifestyle that we've chosen, it's not about just fulfilling our desires. That's not where happiness and freedom is going to be found, fulfilling our desires. And then if you study the Vinaya in all this way, there are many small rules that you have to know. For example, in Ajahn Chah's day, a lot of the monastic requisites in the village monasteries would be bought with money from the monks themselves. They were given money, they would use the money then to buy the bowl, buy the robes, pretty much everything they had. But then once they entered the forest monasteries, any of those requisites which were bought using money, it was a dukkata, or minor offense, to use that requisite. In fact, it was a dukkata for any other monk to use that requisite as well. So in the end, you had some of these robes, shoulder bags, these various things that were bought with money that no one could use. So in the end, what they would do is just gather it all together and burn it. It was good. What do you do? Just burn it and get rid of it. Vinaya encourages us to try to be content with what we have. Ajahn Chah would emphasize this a lot. In the early days of his monastery, there weren't a whole lot of requisites. Life was very simple. It was a very poor area where they were living. So they had to learn to be content. They didn't really have a choice. But then as the monastery grew, as it became more famous, as it became more well supported, there were a lot of requisites, but still that basic emphasis on just being content with simple things. You don't need to have fancy robes, new robes all the time. We're encouraged, if we have a robe, then try to make it last as long as possible. Wash it carefully, hang it up in the line just long enough as necessary. Fold it neatly, keep it clean, look after it properly. And when it starts to get thin, then patch it. Try to make it last as long as you can, to a reasonable extent, even when there's plenty of robes waiting in the storeroom. It's just an attitude of learning how to be content, which is a very simple but important key to happiness that is starting to disappear in our modern society. Just learning how to be content with what we have. Okay, it may not be great. It may not be the newest thing. It may not be flash. But it's good enough.